Hello and welcome back to History for Atheists. My guest today is Dr. Dan McClellan. Dan is the presenter of the Data Over Dogma podcast and a public educator who has won the Society of Biblical Literature's 2023 Richards Award for Public Scholarship for his YouTube and TikTok videos on the academic study of the Bible. He's also the author of The Bible Says So, where we get right and wrong about Scripture's most controversial issues. Dan holds a Master's in Jewish Studies from Oxford and did his doctorate in Hebrew Bible Studies under Francesca Stavrakopoulou at Exeter University. Dan spends a lot of his time correcting erroneous and simplistic ideas about the Hebrew Bible, called the Old Testament by Christians, that are held by Christian fundamentalists and biblical literalists. But I've found many of my fellow atheists have similarly poor understanding of these texts and their cultural context. So I invited Dan to discuss what current critical scholarship can tell us about this subject, and asked him about some common claims about the Hebrew biblical texts made by atheists. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Dan McClellan. So, Dan McClellan, thank you very much for coming on History for Atheists, and welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem at all. I suppose first thing I should say is that there are some people who don't like you, Dan. I don't know what you've been
There are a lot
up
of people who don't like me, but
It was funny when I announced on Twitter and elsewhere that you were coming on the show. Many people were very happy, but other people were not. And it seems that you've been naughty, Dan. You've been annoying people. But I recognise some of the tone, because when other channels announce that I'm coming on, there are atheists who say very similar things about me. So I think maybe you and I, and this is another reason I wanted to have you on the show, you and I have been doing very similar things for some time. We've just been doing it in opposite directions. So I've been pointing out the mistakes and problems with some of the things that my fellow atheists have been arguing about history. And you've been doing the same about your fellow believers. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate framing of where we're coming from.
Okay. Also, I got a couple of comments saying, "Well, Dan McClellan's a Mormon. Why are you getting a Mormon on the show?" And it's like, well, I get believers on my show all the time. I don't see why. As far as I'm concerned, all of you believers are wrong. I don't have a problem with having a Mormon on. But we might get back to that. A couple of the questions that have been suggested kind of did touch on your Mormon background. But probably the one that I wanted to start with, because as we were just discussing in the conversation before we started recording, I've been studying New Testament, the New Testament stuff, New Testament critical scholarship, the origins of Christianity, and the historical backgrounds of early Christianity for 35 years. And that takes up most of my time because I also study other stuff. I haven't really studied a lot of the Old Testament stuff, Near Eastern history, or the context of the Old Testament material, or anything before really about, I suppose, the Maccabees, in any kind of detail. So people often ask me questions, what about this? And I have to say, I'm sorry, I don't know about that. And there's too many people on the internet waffling nonsense about things they haven't actually studied. I don't want to add myself to that list. So I suppose what I wanted to do was get you on, because that's very much your background, not exclusively, but you certainly know a lot more about the critical scholarship on that stuff than I do. Mm-hmm. So, first question. I often see mythicists, or Jesus mythicists, claiming that any day now there will be a massive reversal in the consensus on the historical Jesus. And they argue that this will happen because it's happened before, because until very, very recently, everyone believed that there was a historical Moses and that the Exodus accounts have at least a high degree of historical validity. And then that all changed, right? So there was a sudden reversal fairly recently. Everyone went from believing in the historical Moses and the historical Exodus to now the consensus is against that. And so they hope that one day in the very near future there will be a glorious dawning of Jesus mythicism. Now, I'm leaving that unlikely prospect to one side. Are they right? Is that true? Was there once a great consensus on the historicity of the Exodus story, and did that recently dramatically reverse?
I would say it was probably the consensus view prior to what we would call the rise of critical scholarship and pre-critical discussions about the Bible. I would say the overwhelming majority of folks probably just assumed the historicity of this story. Or now there were certainly those out there who rejected it as nonsense from the very beginning, but these were usually folks who were members of different ethnic groups who were attacking believers, usually because of some kind of nationalistic or ethnic or some other kind of conflict. But you had the majority of folks who just probably assumed that it was historical. Once we get the rise of critical scholarship, pretty quickly you have folks questioning the historicity of Moses. And I would say there is a pendulum that swings back and forth regarding the degree to which we accept the historicity of certain things in the Hebrew Bible, but it's not swinging that wide. It's kind of like, it's kind of like, well, maybe there's a kernel of truth here. Maybe there was some group of people who escaped from slavery, and their story just accreted more and more details and grandeur and scope and all of this over the centuries. And then there are others who say, no, this was just entirely made up. And so in the 19th century, particularly in like German scholarship, certainly you had a lot of skepticism about any historicity at all. But these days, I think it's not as uncommon to have scholars who say, well, maybe there is some historical kernel in there, but it's probably irretrievable. There probably aren't any details that we can nail down as this being historical, this being not historical. The best we can do is say it certainly didn't happen as described in the text. There may have been something there. Some scholars have suggested maybe the Levites are this group that managed to escape from enslavement in Egypt. There are others who say maybe this was folks in the central or northern hill country who escaped from slavery under the boot of other Canaanite tribes. And then the story, as it grew, became the story about Egypt. And so I certainly think there's a pendulum that has been swinging back and forth for some time, but these days the swings are not nearly as wide as they would have been. So I would say the notion, however, that that mythicism is in some way analogous to the way scholarship has treated the Exodus is wishful thinking on their part.
I suspected as much, but thank you for the confirmation. I mean, certainly the people who make that argument, before we move on to Exodus generally, the people who make that argument certainly give the impression that this has all happened in the last 30 or 40 years and happened fairly suddenly. If you're talking about the rise of critical scholarship, we're talking about the 19th century there. And as you say, the swings have been going on backwards and forwards for now 150 or more years.
Yeah, and you certainly had people, going back to the 17th and 18th century who were also highly critical. But I would say since the 19th century, it's probably been a representative, if not majority position. Well, yeah, I would say it's probably become the consensus view within the last 50 years or so. At least it's reached a critical mass, but it's been there. It's been representative for quite some time.
So let's talk about that consensus view then, because I am interested in how much of that story, if anything, according to critical scholars, obviously there are fundamentalists and apologists who just accept it all as unvarnished truth. But what is that consensus view now, or what are the main schools of that consensus view on things like Moses and the Exodus story, the entry into Canaan, and so on?
I think you have the position that this story probably originates in 9th, 8th century BCE. If there is a part of it that predates the late 9th century at the earliest, it's probably the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15. That's poetry.
Okay.
because you don't have historical prose in alphabetic languages, alphabetic scripts, until the end of the 9th century BCE. And so anything in the Hebrew Bible that is written in historical narrative prose is at the very earliest from the late 9th century BCE. And so the narratives that we have in the Hebrew Bible are coming later than that. And so if the Song of the Sea is this pre-9th century poetic memory of this event, the details don't exactly line up with the way we traditionally hear the narrative being told. So there have been changes introduced, but a lot of scholars would suggest 9th, 8th, maybe 7th century BCE, the framework of this story begins to take shape, and then it is being edited over the next few centuries down into the post-exilic period. And so it is reflecting the ideologies of a few different periods, but most recently it would have been a post-exilic editorial hand that is putting it into the shape that we have now. And so it's probably reflecting the idea of a return to the land and reflecting on, being new to the land, returning to the land, the promise of return to the land. That's kind of the guiding feature of this story and what made it salient for the editors who were responsible for getting it into the shape that we have it now, probably in the post-exilic or even Persian period. So it doesn't have nearly as long as a history as a lot of people would like. I have, and other scholars have pointed out, if there is some kind of historicity to it, the name Moses might be one of the little keys to that, because if it is based on Egyptian, and that is hotly debated, but there are scholars who think it is based on Egyptian because it is very similar to names like Ramses and Tutmosis and things like that, it would be something that usually had a theophoric element that went along with it. It would mean born of or son of or something like that. And so Ramses would be born of Ra, son of Ra, and so on. But it's missing the theophoric element. And so one argument is that this might have embarrassed the early transmitters of the story, that there would have been an Egyptian divine name associated with this name, and so they dropped it, and it came into Hebrew as Moses. So it's an incomplete name if it is Egyptian. So there are scholars who will argue that could be interpreted as an indication that there was a historical Moses at some point. But in terms of the details of the story, it's very clearly a cobbling together of multiple different traditions that are frequently in conflict with each other between the 8th and down into the 5th century BCE. So it certainly has nothing to do with the 14th down through the 12th centuries BCE, which is the early and the late dating that most apologists will retreat to in trying to defend the historicity of the Exodus. It just doesn't fit that context at all.
Okay. And one of my followers on Twitter asked me a fairly specific question on this, and asked what your thoughts on the arguments of Richard Elliott Friedman are, and how his arguments are received. What would you say in response to that?
If I recall, Friedman is the one who has published a theory that this might be a social memory about the origin of the Levites. I think that's his theory. Yeah. And this is one of those examples of a scholar who's trying to argue maybe there is a historical core to this. Let's try to retrieve what that historical core is, and comes up with this idea about the Levites. I don't think that it has found a great deal of purchase within critical scholarship. I think a lot of scholars would suggest the Levites are salient in later periods of Judahite and history, and so I don't. It's certainly not the consensus view. It is an argument that is an attractive way to try to bridge the gap and say, let's take the critical scholarship seriously, but let's also try to preserve some sense of historicity to the story. But it's certainly not guiding the consensus these days. If you look at publications, commentaries over the last couple of decades on Exodus, very few of them are going to say, hey, we should be exploring this theory more. Most of them say, he said that, we don't really, we're gonna move on in another direction.
So are you aware, though, that chariot wheels have been found on the bottom of the Red Sea, and that this surely confirms the story of Exodus? I mean, come on.
I'm aware that one man has claimed to find chariot wheels and offered as evidence a picture of coral and then a photograph of a modern boat steering wheel in the sand in shallow water. That would be the inimitable Ron Wyatt.
Yeah.
But I'm also aware of photographs of I think it might be either a late 19th century or an early 20th century shipwreck in another part of that sea that had some wooden wheels and like a tank or something like that. And people have looked at undersea photographs of that and have confused that for chariots. So there's no truth to any of that. That's just the wishful thinking of apologists who are...
And a very strange one at that. Ron Wyatt is remarkable for finding things that no one else seems to be able to get at. It's incredible.
Yes. And if anybody ever has the privilege of being able to visit Jerusalem ever again, if it is a place that is open in the future, the Garden Tomb is a wonderful place to visit, and Ron Wyatt was given permission to go excavate there, and you can go ask them for the Garden Tomb Association's letter about Ron Wyatt, and they'll give you a photocopy of the letter, because he came out and said, "I found the Ark of the Covenant," and it had Jesus's blood on it.
He found the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, and Jesus' blood. It's incredible. He's a veritable Indiana Jones.
Yeah, he's got more, I think, more discoveries related to the Bible than Indiana Jones does.
Good. I think so. Yeah. So just while we're still talking about that earlier period, I remember years ago doing a little bit of reading on and this was a long time ago, on the origins of Yahweh, on the origins of the earliest forms of the Judaic traditions, the Israelite traditions, and I must admit I've forgotten most of that stuff. What's the current thinking on, for example, the origins of Yahweh as a deity?
I think you've had a number of books published in recent years by Ted Lewis and Robert Miller II and Daniel Fleming and others evaluating the early history of Adonai, and I would suggest that the Kenite Midianite hypothesis is still around, but and that is the idea that Adonai was initially a tribal deity associated with the Kenites, the Midianites, tribal groups who were located to the south and the east of Israel, Palestine, and that at some point they migrated into the central and northern hill country, and this is why you have traditions preserved in certain poetry about Adonai coming forth from Paran, from Sinai, from Teman, from these locations to the south, and so there's something there. Ted Lewis, I think, probably reflects my view that we don't know enough about the Midianites to be able to really figure out if they worshipped a deity named Adonai. It's a tantalizing theory, but we just don't have enough data to say for sure. Robert Miller II is a little more positive about that. His book is making the case that Adonai was a Midianite deity and thinks that archaeologists have even uncovered a temple that would have been dedicated to Adonai. Daniel Fleming's book is interesting because it's discussing the appearance on two inscriptions from the early 14th and then the 13th centuries BCE in Egypt that mention the Shasu of the land of, and then it's Yahoo or something like that. And it is it's spelled very similar to the Tetragrammaton, only it has the Egyptian equivalent of like a glottal stop at the very end rather than a hey. And a lot of scholars think that this could be the pre-divine name version of the divine name. It's the name of a land, or slightly less likely the name of a people, not the name of a deity. But it very easily could have turned into the name of the deity worshipped by the people who occupied that land. And so Daniel Fleming discusses how that could have happened. And this could be associated with folks who were located to the south and the east. So there is some potential overlap with the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis. But I think what most scholars can agree on is that Adonai seems to be a secondary addition to the Israelite pantheon, that originally it was the Northwest Semitic patriarchal high deity El, who was the patron deity of Israel, and then Adonai seems to be added to the pantheon and then seems to be conflated with El very soon after that. And so Adonai is an outsider deity. And if Adonai comes from the area of Midian, the Midianite tribes, that I think we don't really have enough data to say for sure, but that's like a leading possibility.
Okay. And you just mentioned a pantheon. Yes. Are you telling me that the Ten Commandments was wrong when it presented the early Israelites as being purely monotheistic? They're actually polytheistic, eh?
Well, I would say the Ten Commandments actually supports a polytheistic understanding, because the commandment is to have no other gods before me, al-panai, which literally means in front of my face. So initially that probably had a spatial sense. Don't have other divine images in the space reserved for my divine image. But yes, absolutely. There are other gods recognized from beginning to end, not just in the Hebrew Bible, but in the New Testament. The existence of other gods is not something that was actually challenged. What was challenged was their relevance and their power. And so the rhetoric from Deutero-Isaiah and later, I am and there is no other, that kind of rhetoric doesn't reflect the notion of the exclusive existence of the God of Israel so much as demand an exclusive relationship between the people of Israel and the God of Israel. And I usually compare it to how I thought about the Denver Broncos in the late 90s. Because you would have heard me commonly say that the Raiders aren't even a real football team. There was nobody else but the Broncos. They are the only ones. And that kind of there I am and there is no other, and you're nothing and less than nothing, that's rhetoric. That's rhetoric that is intended to deny the relevance and the power of the deities of the other nations of the earth. But you also have recognition that these are real deities. And I have argued that in 2 Kings 3:27, you even have an example of Adonai being defeated by the deity of another nation and having the coalition to whom Adonai had promised victory being run out of the country. So after failing to secure that victory.
Yeah, actually, when I mentioned the Ten Commandments, I was referring to the movie rather than the. And I must caution you that American football analogies don't work terribly well. The audience, everything you just said about the Denver Broncos and so on just went straight over my head. So,
touche.
I got the general gist. So what we're talking about, from the sounds of things, is a move from a kind of a Near Eastern polytheism, maybe towards something more like henotheism, and then eventually to monotheism. And if that's the case, what date brackets can we put on those three stages? Or is that not the case? Is that too simplistic?
I would say that's a little simplistic. Henotheism and monolatry, these are frameworks that were developed in the late 19th century by anthropologists in order to try to find a middle ground between polytheism and monotheism, because they were looking in the Bible and they were like, man, this is not exactly monotheistic. And so they came up with these other categories. But when you look at scholars today trying to defend the monotheism of the Hebrew Bible, they're really describing henotheism and monolatry, because it's quite clear that the biblical authors acknowledge the gods of other nations. This is something I find all the time when I get into debates on social media with other folks. I'll say the Bible's not monotheistic, and they will be like, there's only one God. And then it's like, what about these other gods? And they're like, they call them gods. They were second tier gods. They weren't fully God. They were small g God. They weren't big G God. It's like, okay, so you just acknowledged that it is not what you initially said it was.
Yeah.
I would suggest that and I've got I presented at a conference last year at Brown University. I'm editing the proceedings from that conference right now. This is going to be a volume, hopefully, that will come out next year, that argues that there is no monotheism in the Bible, period. That monotheism is a post-biblical philosophical innovation that at best starts up in the 3rd, 4th centuries CE. But monotheism, as we have used the term in the modern world, the term was coined in 1660 by Henry Moore. And ever since then, it has been used in a variety of different ways, but it is primarily functioning as a value judgment and an identity marker, which means the priority is not the necessary and sufficient features of monotheism. The priority is making sure it separates the good guys from the bad guys, and the good guys being us, the bad guys being everybody else. And so the term has a rather sordid history. But I would say that you don't have it anywhere in the Bible. And what you have is a pretty consistent, just the world is just chock full of deities and divine agents, and our God just happens to be the biggest and the best. And I would distinguish cosmic sovereignty from geopolitical sovereignty, and I would suggest that the God of Israel had cosmic sovereignty from the earliest periods, not when Adonai was a second-tier deity, like what we probably see in Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, but soon after that, when Adonai and El are conflated, they have rule over all the other gods of the pantheon. However, every god had its own nation, and it was sovereign within that nation, and Adonai's nation was Israel, and that was it. Yeah. And so you have Naaman in 2 Kings, wants to worship Adonai when he's back home in Syria. So he brings 2 cartloads of Israelite soil back with him. The idea being, I can't worship Adonai away from Israelite soil. I'll bring some Israelite soil with me. That way I can worship Adonai. And people are like, well, Naaman wasn't an Israelite. He was not reflecting good biblical theology. Same thing with David. Because when Saul is chasing David, there's one part where they're on hillsides opposite a valley. And David says, your men are forcing me out of Adonai's inheritance, saying to me, go worship other gods. Israel was Adonai's inheritance. The idea is if I'm outside of Israel, I can't worship Adonai. I've got to worship whatever deity is sovereign within the territory I'm in. Yeah. And so kicking David out of Israel means David has no choice but to worship other gods. And this was a problem with the exile. How can we sing the song of Adonai in a foreign land? You can't worship your deity beyond the boundary of that deity's purview. And so that's what gives rise to the universalization of Adonai. And this is something that I argue takes place in the post-exilic period. And this is where Adonai's geopolitical sovereignty is expanded to the whole earth. So I would suggest that there is a transition where Adonai goes from territorial deity on earth, cosmic ruler in the heavens, to cosmic ruler in the heavens, sovereign over all the nations on earth. And I would suggest that pivot happens following the exile.
So post-exile, but really probably taking the form that most modern believers would take or think of it with their God, probably in that intertestamental period, the period kind of after the Hebrew Bible, before the what we would call the New Testament books.
I would say that's a period when philosophical inquiry and scrutiny begins to be applied to the texts of the Bible. But we don't have, for instance, a God who is without body parts and passion until after the Bible, after the New Testament.
Yeah, gotcha.
We don't have a God who creates ex nihilo until after the New Testament. Gotcha. And I would suggest we don't have anything that could be plausibly identified as monotheism as we understand the term today until after the New Testament as well. And that's when Greek philosophical frameworks kind of take over And that's when the hierarchy of the church is reified and allows that thinking to then be enforced and imposed upon all Christian thinkers.
Okay. Before we move on into that later period in more detail, can we go back into the earlier stuff? And let's get back to my friends, my fellow atheists. One of the slurs that they make about Christianity and about religion in general is that it's the imaginings of Bronze Age goat herders.
Yeah.
How many Bronze Age goat herders are involved in what you were just talking about?
Zero, because the Bronze Age ended before any syllable of the Hebrew Bible was written down.
Sure.
The earliest literary layers of the Hebrew Bible are probably fragments of poetry that are embedded within broader poetic compositions. The Song of Deborah, the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, maybe the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, Jacob's blessings in Genesis 49. And they might go back as far as 1000 BCE, very, very earliest, maybe 1100 BCE. Bronze Age transitions to Iron Age around 1200 BCE, so a century before that. So we have absolutely zero Bronze Age writing in the Hebrew Bible. The overwhelming majority of it is coming from probably between the 7th century BCE and the 5th century BCE, and it is being written by palace scribes, temple scribes, the most educated people in these societies, who were probably born into privileged families. There's a possibility they were enslaved, but they were put through scribal training as enslaved folks. I think that's probably more common in the Greco-Roman period rather than earlier, but there's a possibility of that. But these would have been the elites who are responsible for writing the overwhelming majority of the Hebrew Bible. And they're engaging with the literary milieu, whether it's Egyptian literature or Babylonian literature, Akkadian literature. They're engaging with it, and they're adapting and adopting things, and they're responding to things, and there's polemics, and it's phenomenally creative. And so I think it does a disservice to the composers of these texts to dismiss them as Bronze Age goat herders, because they were coming from much later than that, and they were among the most educated people in these societies. Sure. And so, that's a criticism that, while I understand where it's coming from, is wildly inaccurate.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually meant to be anything more than a provocative statement. Slightly more serious question, though. I think most people would be aware that there are parallels between some of the elements in the Hebrew Bible and other Near Eastern literature, and the most obvious one is the flood story, the Noah story. Now, what I often see is that this is described; these parallels are attributed to plagiarism. So the writers of the Hebrew Bible plagiarized these earlier texts, and so people who take them seriously, particularly those who take them literally and teach them in science classrooms, but that's another story, are being completely foolish, because this is pure plagiarism. What is the relationship, the literary and cultural relationship between those stories, and that accounts for those parallels? Is it plagiarism? Is that accurate?
I think that's a modern concept. I think if we tried to define exactly what was going on with these texts, somebody squinting at it could probably make some of the edges overlap a little bit, some of those blurry edges. But no, I wouldn't call it plagiarism for a number of reasons. One, when it comes to like the flood account, this is priests, scribal classes writing stories in the exilic and the post-exilic period, where they're engaging with the conventional wisdom of their oppressors, the people who have forcibly migrated them into Babylon and are surrounding them and are in many ways trying to assimilate them trying to destroy their cultural, their ethnic identity. And so the flood account is probably engaging with traditions in circulation in the 6th century BCE in Babylon. But there would have been numerous iterations of these traditions. And I think it would be more accurate to say it's engaging with the zeitgeist rather than engaging with one person's publication of this story. Yep. Because you have versions of this story that go all the way back to Sumer and Sumerian, and all the way down into the 6th and the 5th centuries BCE in Akkadian, an entirely different language. And so the flood story is taking this notion that there was a flood at some point, and that this was a big turning point in the history of at least the earth, and then it's just re-articulating it through a Judahite lens. So it is absolutely borrowing the bones, the skeleton of this narrative, but it's not taking one person's text and just copying it and then trying to pass it off as another person's composition. These are like folk tales. Nobody is asserting authorship or ownership of these stories, and it's kind of similar to, you know, the DHS recently released a video where they have a version of the song God's Gonna oh shoot, no, I forget that song. God's Gonna Tear You Down. It's
the one that Johnny Cash covered. Yeah.
Right. So that's a folk song. Like nobody knows who originally wrote it, but you've got dozens of different versions of it. And so it's now, and you know, music copyright stuff, that's an entirely different story. But they're definitely engaging with the folklore and the folk tales, and they're saying, we're going to tell our version of the story and it's similar to yours, but we're going to correct all the stuff that you got wrong about it, and we're going to tell it in a better way. And it's going to reflect.
They're doing something with it.
Yes.
I suppose, I mean, it's not really hugely significant, but they probably did think that there was a flood, though, didn't they?
I think, yeah. I think the authors probably thought they were the curators of this tale from hoary antiquity that they probably thought did happen. But when we look at the versions of this story, and it's associated with the king lists when you go into the Mesopotamian literature, and there wasn't a flood in the earliest versions of the king lists, and then suddenly a flood shows up in the stories. So the stories are altered as they're being passed down. There are examples of things in the Hebrew Bible that do seem to be word for word rip-offs of other texts.
Okay.
And I'll give two examples, and both of them seem to be appropriations of traditions or poetry attributed to Baal, the Northwest Semitic storm deity, on the part of priests, scribal classes devoted to Adonai. And one of them is Isaiah 27:1. And this is where Isaiah says, in that day, Adonai will punish with his swift and hard sword Leviathan, the wriggling serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, the dragon that lives in the sea. And so you've got this mythological concept of this chaotic sea monster that God is going to defeat in some eschatological future. We discovered the Ugaritic literature, which dates to between around 1400 and 1200 BCE, the city on the coast of Syria further north. And it's written in a language closely associated with Hebrew. But it goes away before the Hebrew Bible starts up. And we find a story about Baal. And it's repeated a couple different times where somebody talking about Baal says, when you defeated Leton, which is the Ugaritic cognate for Leviathan, the wriggling serpent, the twisting serpent, the dragon with 7 heads. Yep. So some of those words are identical between the Ugaritic and the Hebrew, and then the differences are very slight differences, and largely a result of one being written in Ugaritic, one being written in Hebrew. So that's an example of a tradition that comes from 700 years before Isaiah, that is popping up in Isaiah almost word for word. Now, a lot of scholars, there are very few scholars who think that Isaiah was like, I got this Ugaritic text. This is the good stuff. And actually copied it word for word. More than likely, they're both, excuse me, more than likely, they're both drawing from a shared poetic tradition. And the words are just, they're very stable in that poetic tradition. And so Isaiah is sharing something that had been passed down for 700, 800 years. I'm going to take a drink.
Sure. So perhaps a little bit like someone who might, without attribution, quote a bit of Henry V.
Yeah.
In an appropriate bit, and say once more under the breach, dear friends, and we'll close up the wall with our English dead, without saying, oh, by the way, I'm quoting Henry V.
Yeah, or somebody who will say, spare the rod, spoil the child.
Sure.
And other people are like, Proverbs. No, not Proverbs. It's actually an erotic poem from the 18th century that's riffing on Proverbs. So, but yeah, there's that kind of stuff is in the air, and so I think that's probably what's going on there. There's another example that I think could be called plagiarism.
Yeah.
And that's Psalm 29. And this is a psalm where it's talking about Adonai and it's praising Adonai, and it talks about 7 different references to the voice of Adonai, Kol Adonai. And all of these references represent God's voice as thunder, as lightning, as violent weather. So this is right in the storm deity wheelhouse. And there are some place names that are mentioned in the psalm. Lebanon, I think Kirion is one of them. And then you have Kadesh. All 3 of these places are further north from Israel. They're not a part of Israel. They're a part of Syria. They're a part of Phoenicia. They're a part of Baal's territory. Yeah. And so a lot of scholars suggest that this was probably a hymn to Baal, and it could have been as simple as repeating it and then scratching out Baal and writing in Adonai. Because they left the place names in, and those place names are part of Baal's purview, not Adonai's purview. So that is something that I think could potentially qualify as something we would label plagiarism.
Sure, gotcha. Slightly more specific and later, but my dear friends, the mythicists, like to claim that there was a tradition of a suffering Messiah before Christianity. So they claim that the mythic Jesus idea grew out of a second or pre-second temporal Jewish tradition of an idea of a Messiah who was going to come to earth and suffer, or who was going to maybe suffer full stop, maybe in the heavens. And they cite some non-mythicists, some Jewish scholars, particularly Israel Knoll, who has published a book making a claim about a pre-Christian suffering Messiah. So what are your thoughts on that? I know what my thoughts on that are, and I've discussed this with Davis and various others. But how would you summarise the consensus on whether or not that is a valid idea?
I would say if I'm trying to represent the consensus, I would say there's not really a case to make for a suffering Messiah prior to maybe the 1st century BCE.
Okay.
I think that's a fuzzy period where you begin to. I think people are arguing maybe the folks who are responsible for the earliest versions of what would later become the Targum or something like that are interpreting Isaiah 53 and other texts as a reference to a Messiah figure, an anointed figure who's going to suffer, who maybe even is going to die and then be resurrected. I disagree entirely with that. I don't think you have that concept anywhere until the followers of Jesus had to go back to the drawing board and decided, okay, we think he's resurrected. Let's go find our resurrected Messiah in the Hebrew Bible, and then reread a lot of texts that were never intended to be prophetic, never intended to be about a Messiah, as if they were about a Messiah. Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, a bunch of other things where we've mainly got lament literature, and they're reinterpreting it as prophecies about a future dying and rising Messiah. Now I said dying and rising, which fits into the Fraserian dying and rising God motif, which is what the mythicists love to impose upon the data to try to interpret every deity and their mother as as the antecedent and the template for the conjuring up of the story of Jesus. But I think by far the best explanation, the one that requires the fewest assumptions, the one that is most parsimonious, is that there was a guy who was an apocalyptic itinerant Jewish preacher who was executed for his troubles, and then a tradition began to spread about his resurrection, and everybody ran with that. I think that makes the most sense out of all of this. But there are certainly scholars who think that there was a pre-Christian tradition of a suffering, dying Messiah, but it wouldn't have been. I think 1st century BCE is probably as early as most of them would go, maybe down to the Maccabean period if somebody wants to get really crazy, but certainly not going back to the composition of Deutero-Isaiah or anything like that. I don't think there's a case at all to make about that.
But I think the argument is based very much on the idea that it was around in that intertestamental period, so it was around in the 1st century BC.
Okay.
I'm dubious about it, I must say. I don't think it actually lends a great deal of strength to what is already a pretty weak argument on the part of the mythicists, and you and I are in furious agreement on the most parsimonious reading of the evidence, but we don't need to go into a lot of detail on that. There's a couple of fairly sort of, just before we wrap up, fairly specific arguments that we sometimes see in discourse between atheists and believers. Mm-hmm. One of them, and I must admit I don't pay a lot of attention to this, but that the argument that Numbers 5 actually says that God is in favour of abortion. Mm-hmm. This comes up in the abortion debate, and where atheists and believers are sometimes battling it out, and some atheists say Numbers 5 says your God is in favour of abortion.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that as a critical scholar?
I think this is an issue where scholars are a little more divided. It all comes down to whether or not you think the sotah, which is this ordeal, whether or not you think this has a pregnancy in view. And the main arguments from the folks who think there is a pregnancy in view, that this, the idea is that the man's suspicions are catalyzed by the existence of a pregnancy. And he's like, I didn't do that. Who did this? And then he takes her to the priest. I don't think that is indicated by the text. And another thing that they will interpret from the text, the two outcomes of the ordeal, if God condemns the woman, if she is determined by the ordeal to be guilty, is that her thigh will rot, and her thigh will drop, and then her womb will. And there's this bizarre verb that does not occur very much at all. It might be the only place it ever occurs. If it occurs anywhere else, it's like once or maybe twice. That her womb will do something. And this verb we find cognates in like Akkadian, where it can refer to the blossoming of a flower, but it can also just refer to something that is growing or getting larger. And so you could interpret it to mean the womb swells up. And so you've got disfigured genitals, basically, which is imagery that is associated with infertility. The other interpretation is that the idea of blossoming is that the womb discharges, and that would be a miscarriage. And so that's how some folks interpret that verb. Now, I think it's much more likely that this is about fertility or infertility, that the curse, this is imagery associated with infertility, and then the blessing, if the woman is innocent, it says she will conceive. If there's a pregnancy in view, it would just say, she will have a healthy kid or something like that. It does not say that. It says she will conceive. So I think the blessing is future conception. And when we look at the earliest Jewish literature, there are debates about whether or not it would be appropriate to subject a pregnant woman to the sotah. Now, this is taking place in a period when the temple is gone, so it's all academic anyway. But they decide, yes, it would be appropriate to subject this woman to the sotah ritual. That's the decision that they make. So I think the most likely conclusion is that the authors did not. The idea was not this is a clearly pregnant woman, and the pregnancy is what causes the suspicion on the part of the husband. I don't think that's there. But I would say if the woman is pregnant, if she's guilty, that's obviously going to result in the death of the fetus. And so I would say at best, I would say it would indicate that God does not have much concern at all for a fetus, whether it is conceived through adultery or not. And that's kind of consistent with the representation of God throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible, where God is commanding the Israelites to slaughter babies. And so I don't know that it's, and the other reason I am wary of people leveraging this in defense of a pro-abortion stance is because it's not like this was the woman's agency or choice or anything like that.
Sure.
She's being forcibly subjected to something that is going to kill her or permanently disfigure her if God decides she's guilty, and if she's pregnant, kill her unborn child against her will. So I don't think that's particularly helpful, although that I don't always see it leveraged in that way. I would agree that it does indicate that God doesn't really show much concern for the unborn, and I've argued in print and in many videos and pretty much every week on Twitter that you go to Exodus 21 and you can see that an injury to a pregnant woman that causes a miscarriage, that's a fine. And the husband determines the fine, and it's arbitrated by judges, so it's not exorbitant. If that injury results in the death of the woman, death penalty, which is a pretty clear indication that a fetus was not considered a full legal and moral person. It was even more property than an enslaved person was. So I think that's a good indication that the God of the Hebrew Bible is certainly not demanding that unborn fetuses be protected because they're considered full moral and legal persons. They're definitely not in the Hebrew Bible.
Gotcha. Thanks. Final question from me, and I was thinking this morning, I was trying to remember how I first came across you. It might have been on TikTok. I remember when I first came across you, I thought, oh yeah, this guy, he's saying very similar things to the things I say, certainly about the New Testament stuff, Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet and so on. So I kind of assumed you were an unbeliever and was a little surprised to find that you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, so a Mormon. Personal question, do you use similar critical analysis on the origins of the Mormon faith as you do on the origins of, say, the Old Testament faith?
Yes, I do, and I've published some of that as well. Now, the nature of critical analysis of the Book of Mormon is quite different from critical analysis of the Bible, but I worked as a scripture translation supervisor for the LDS Church for just over a decade. So I spent a lot of time interrogating linguistically the Book of Mormon, other LDS scripture, as well as helping the LDS Church develop a process for publishing editions of the Bible in other languages. And I always approached the Book of Mormon within that kind of context as a literary product of the 19th century. And so when I've engaged the question of interpretation, the question of background, the question of origin, all this kind of stuff, the only way to approach it that I think puts data over dogma is to treat it as a literary product of the early 19th century. And so I've been highly critical of attempts that have been made in recent years to argue that the language of the Book of Mormon is early modern English, that there's no way Joseph Smith could have known this, therefore it is inspired and all that kind of stuff. I've been critical of that. And I have argued that there are passages in the Book of Mormon, in the Doctrine and Covenants, and elsewhere that historically have been misinterpreted by the church and its leadership, and have argued for a more critical approach that better situates these things within the early 19th century context and results in entirely different interpretations. And I've presented that research at conferences. I've published it in LDS-related journals. So, yeah, I absolutely apply that to the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, and things like that as well. However, it's not my area of academic expertise, and so it's not a very common topic of discussion on my channel, and that infuriates an awful lot of people. But
I can imagine. So I can imagine you probably annoy your fellow Mormons as much as you annoy all those fundamentalist Christians.
I at least the Mormons who are on Twitter, yes, I keep them up in the night, evidently. So, but the folks in my congregation where I've taught Sunday school as recently as 3 years ago, I don't hear a lot of negative comments from them. But yeah, the ones on Twitter who voted for Trump, they can't stand me.
Yes, I've seen some political to and fro on your Twitter account.
That tends to be the main vector of hate for me from other Latter-day Saints. Whenever I see criticism like that, I know it is going to reduce to, these are right-wing authoritarians. They do not like liberals. They do not like progressives. So I'm a poster child for everything that is wrong with progressive Mormons.
You're a libtard. Apparently, I'm a libtard as well. So, Dan, that was great. I think we covered a fair bit of ground there, and covered most of the questions that my followers on social media asked me to ask you. So this is your opportunity to plug your book, because I believe you published a book. I think it was earlier this year, maybe late last year.
End of April of this year. Right. Yes. Yeah. The Bible says so, what we get right and wrong about Scripture's most controversial issues. The subtitle is not my work. So just if there's any complaining about that. But this was a fun book to write. It was basically just it was pitched to me by the publisher as a greatest hits of my social media work, and I have chapters. There are 18 or 19 of them where each one is just addressing a different claim about what the Bible says. So the Bible says abortion is murder. The Bible says homosexuality is an abomination. The Bible says you should beat your kids. The Bible says there's only one God. All of those things are, and many others I treat in the book. And it's not an academic treatment. It's a more popular trade volume. So it's written hopefully in a more accessible language register. I have heard some feedback from folks who have said it still gets in the weeds from time to time, but there's still my annoying attitude and sense of humor coming through in the pages. Yeah, and I also got to narrate the audiobook. So for those who prefer to consume their literature audially, that was a lot of fun to do. And the feedback I've gotten from the audiobook has been universally positive. I was evidently it came through just fine, and people have really enjoyed listening to me.
That's great.
And I even get to cuss a little bit. So I was telling people, if you want to hear me say the F word, get the audiobook.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Dan. We are actually in what I call the lull, which is the period between Easter and Halloween, where you and I don't have to constantly battle the idea that those festivals, Christmas, Easter, pagan in origin. And so this is where we get to relax a little bit. Don't worry. October is coming, and
Yeah.
soon we will both have to join each other in the trenches on that one. Appreciate your work on that, and on a great many other fronts. Dan, it has been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for giving up your time. And,
well, thank you for having me. I had a great time.
Yeah, no worries at all. And have a great day. Thanks for being on History for Atheists.
Thank you, Tim.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dan McClellan about the history and background to the text of the Hebrew Bible. Once again, his new book is The Bible Says So, What We Can Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues. I'll put a link in the description below. But until next time, see you again here soon.